um, got on a plane and went off to Argentina.
Yes.
Hispanic country, right? And yet it was a safe Hispanic country from the prejudices that were easy for me to develop in the United States. Because let me tell you, okay, so two of my companions down there, one of them was named Elder Fratantueno, Normando was his first name, and he came from Bahia Blanca, which is in the Buenos Aires province. The name should tell you that he comes from Italian background, right?
Uh-huh.
A lot of Italians, a lot of descendants of Italians. But my favorite companion was a man named um, Oscar Hughes, Heghes, Hughes, and he was as blonde-haired and blue-eyed as yours truly. And he comes from the southern part of the country, a state called Chubut, but a town called Rawson, Rawson, and it looks very English, and it is very English because in the early 1900s, folks from England immigrated from that country to Argentina, and he is the descendant of those folks. As a whole, Argentina is relatively white compared to most South American countries, where most countries south of our border have a lot of native influence in their genetic makeup. Argentina is not that much. But I remember about halfway through my time there, meeting one of my favorite people there, and his name was Elder Velasquez, and he came from the province of Jujuy, which is way up in the corner of Argentina, almost into Bolivia. You know, Bolivia is very native influenced country, right? A lot of Incan descent up there. And so is Jujuy, right next to it. And so Elder Velasquez was much, much darker. And so I'd gotten used to, oh, these natives, they look very much like me. And all of a sudden I had to go, oh, wait a second. That's not the only definition.
Huh.
And so as he's talking about light and dark, suddenly I was seeing back to that time going, oh, you know, in South America, in Argentina specifically, there was still a who's European here and who's not.
Yes.
And so there was
Huh.
that prejudice built in,
Yeah.
or that,
Just the way in the United States, European versus
that's right. And
Latino.
and it was very interesting for me to see that because I hadn't quite realized that same type of dynamic before that time.
Huh.
And but it's really easy to overlook that when you're the person who gets to have the privilege that doesn't have to notice it.
Yes.
Elder Velasquez had to he had to notice more because he felt that I'm not that kind of Hispanic. I'm not a, you know, Argentina has a whole lot of German and Italian descendants from both world wars, and he was not. And so in Argentina, there's a primacy to those relatively recent European immigrants. And so how does he sit in that larger picture? But then that's partially what he's asking in this question. How do we sit in that larger picture,
Yes.
right? It's tough for us. We don't have to face that as white in America. But how do we perpetuate the house slave versus the field slave mythology?
Mm.
You know, that so and so is better because, for whatever reason, we put the because on. You know, like in Hispanic areas, that's, well, he speaks pretty good English, so he must be. And speaking good English doesn't mean you're a better person, right? And yet that's our tendency in America, is to do that.
Yes.
And so part of chapter 9 was a critique of his own culture, his own race, right?
Yes.
Saying, how are you doing that? But it's also us saying, how do we benefit from that happening? And what are we going to do about it? Right? How do we not give in to that tendency to favor somebody over another for whatever reason, especially at the expense of someone else? Let me tell you about what happened this week. Have you gone by the church lately and seen our marquee?
Yes, I go on Monday to hear the service.
Okay. Oh yeah. So our marquee now says we condemn white supremacy.
Yes.
Very shortly after putting that up, we got an email. Okay. Let me read the email to you. Where did I put it? Oh, here it is. So, saw the marquee, we condemn white supremacy. Are you going to put up we condemn Black Lives Matter? So I wrote back, said, Dear Mr. G, thank you for your recent inquiry regarding the statement on our marquee regarding condemning white superiority and asking if we would also condemn Black Lives Matter. The answer, of course, is an emphatic no.
No.
And the reason why is found in the names employed by the two movements. We use Jesus Christ as our model of behavior, and his life and teaching insistently refused to assert the superiority of any human group over another. In fact, he spoke most emphatically against this tendency. In addition, Jesus consistently called us to notice, care about, and help those who are overlooked, ignored, and oppressed, because those forgotten lives do matter. Thank you for caring about those who fall into this second category. I thought I was really eloquent and one just solving all the issues. And I figured he'd just give in to me. And this is what he said. Reverend, then you are a racist. BLM is a racist group who rioted, looted, and burned down innocent businesses. As a man of the cloth, you should be ashamed. This is one of the reasons why I quit going to church. Church is not a platform for political agenda.
And Jesus was so political.
Jesus was so political. And Jesus stepped into roles like that on a regular basis. And I thought I eloquently said that. But of course, what he's saying is, I see the way they're doing something wrong. So they must be as bad as what you're condemning. And the difference is hard to explain to someone who doesn't want to be explained to. The one is in a space of superiority and advantage. The other is in a space of something less than that, something substandard to that superiority. And so it's trying to claw to be noticed. And sometimes it does mean inappropriate ways of getting that notice. So how do I answer his stuff that says I'm a racist, which I gladly embrace that I'm a racist, but not in the same way he's saying
it. I was going to say, yes, I am a racist. We all are, to some extent or another, but not the way he intends. But I don't know that dialoguing with him is useful at this point, is it?
The hard part about that, no, I think in many ways it isn't useful, but in a very real way, unless we dialogue, unless we step into things that aren't going to solve anything, the dialogue is going to get harder and harder and less effective.
Oh yes, you've talked about that in other classes. Now I remember. Go ahead and be uncomfortable in your conversations with people.
Yeah, but it's difficult. So when you get to the white chapter, right?
Yes.
And we're looking at the issues that he brings up there. He's trying to help us to figure out, how do we relate to people like these folks? And part of what it convicted in me, Judith, is that So for example, this man, the more I try to solve him, the more I may be taking my efforts away from solving the system that causes him.
Oh, that's profound.
And that hit me very hard from what he was saying.
Oh, where did you get that insight from?
From his writings. Let me tell you a couple of the different places. So at one point he says, let me find it here. And yet racist power thrives on anti-white racist ideas. More hatred only makes their power greater. In losing focus on racist power, they fail to challenge anti-black racist policies, which means those policies are more likely to flourish. Going after white people instead of racist power prolongs the policies harming black life. In the end, hating white people becomes hating black people.
Yes.
And so how do I step into the most useful way of doing what it is that needs to be done? It's hard because some of the people that I talk about on a regular basis, I got really good answers of how they need to be fixed.
But Kendrick pointed out that the white supremacists, their behavior acts against the best interests of most white people.
Absolutely.
It's only the wealthy whites that benefit from what they're doing.
Yeah. And so the question we have to ask is how do we step into those roles in the best way possible to solve the widest to change society, not just an individual.
Yes.
And that's not simple because most of us don't have as much power to change the system.
Correct.
As what we do to be an influence in a life. How do I recruit that person who now seems to be on the other side of something to step into a role that might help rather than hurt? Or do I?
It was interesting to see the progression from Malcolm X to being full of hate to getting into the true Islam that was not full of hate and his growth.
Yeah.
I thought that was very interesting in that chapter.
Yeah, because violence is not necessarily an inappropriate response. It's not a good response, but it's not necessarily an inappropriate response to the moment. But is it that which will change things the most? And sometimes nonviolence, if we're not careful, can become just passivity. We don't want to do that either, right? We want to somehow actively do something that changes things. Not just actively beat somebody over the head, because that doesn't fix it. But actively makes a difference. It's hard to figure out, Judith. If you get the right solution, you let me know.
Yeah, they say if you can state the problem clearly enough, the solution is lying in there, but I can't get it yet.
I think part of it helped me to hear the name of the one book that he referred to, The Hate That Hate Produced.
Yes.
How is it that we're allowing their hate to produce hate in me, but also the other way around? Is my hate or my action enlarging their hate, or is it enlarging their part in helping to change things? And so this whole section has made me have to really struggle with, are all my actions that what you're producing the best result, or something else?
It's a challenge.
It's a challenge, and not a simple challenge.
No.
But that's why.
It seems as if, he says whites could benefit from equity as well, but the propaganda denies that.
Yeah.
And to point out that 40 million white people died in World War II, 500,000 white people died in the Civil War. Anti-white is anti-human. It's I don't know.
It's pretty
And
amazing, isn't it?
then his writing a piece for the paper to stop hating whites for being themselves. That was pretty moving too when
Yeah.
he got to the end of the chapter to say that.
Yeah. One of the great things that I've learned in my life is that truth doesn't necessarily overcome ideology.
Truth does not overcome ideology.
Not necessarily, right? How you present truth, how you use truth, how you live in the relationship between you, that other person, and your truth can change things. But because you're right, doesn't necessarily mean that anything happens in that other person.
Oh,
And if
yeah, that I can grasp. The
if we're
beginning of what you said, I thought, no, my brain just can't grasp that.
well, but if our goal ultimately, let's just look at the current political divide in America. Much of it over racial issues. Because I'm right doesn't mean that person's going to listen to me better. I
Yes.
have to figure out how to present what I have and what I know in a way that they are able to
He can
grasp.
understand.
That's right. And that I don't automatically trigger some of those things that send him further into his defensiveness, into his whiteness, you know,
Oh.
his protection of.
Yes, yes. Do
You
you
know,
play
those,
chess?
I have, but it's been a long time since I've really played it
Oh,
well.
I was thinking that if somebody were good at chess, whatever happens there in terms of anticipating moves, I couldn't even learn chess because I can't think that far ahead.
Yeah.
Would to be able to do what you're saying you want to be able to do, not to make the other person defensive, but to make them be more open-minded.
Yeah. And that's the ongoing challenge, isn't it? To try to figure out what truly solves the situation. I'll tell you, one of my biggest fears right now is not the election, it's reaction to the election.
Yeah, my friend Helen and I were talking today about people threatening to have a civil war if Trump loses.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
That's very scary.
Yeah, and feeling very self-righteous, almost needing to do that according to their belief in the God they're believing in right now. That they've
Yes,
got to do
yes.
that to save that God's position, which is tough, isn't it?
Very tough. I'm reading a book called Great Small Things or something. It's a novel about a black nurse who the father of a baby said he wanted her to keep her hands off his baby.
Uh-huh.
And of course the baby codes, and she's the only one available to save it, and she hesitates and so gets criminal charges up against her. But when they made a chapter in the book trying to explain why the father had these ideas that he has, and to begin to be able to understand his point of view, he thought a black man killed his brother.
Yeah. Yeah.
So to try to understand the other person's history to get to their point of view.
Even if that history is still abhorrent to you, and those decisions are still, from your mind, not necessary to what that person wants, to hear why it is that it makes a difference in his mind is important.
I mean, you don't know this person who's dialoguing with you vis-a-vis
the sign. I don't.
The sign.
It's just somebody who was driving past and saw the sign, which is exactly what we want. We want people to look at that marquee.
Yeah. I expected it to be smashed, frankly.
Yeah, and you know what? That's an interesting part about today, is that we think that something like that needs to be done, right? That one of my other friends who I've talked about a lot, Dean.
Dean, yeah, I thought you have a new Dean. Yes.
He wrote to me today, because he put up something that I consider kind of stupid. So I just put the laughing icon, right? I'm just laughing at that thing. He said, why do you just laugh at my stuff? He said, right? And then he went further down, and it became a more and more of a rant. And it says, I put that, so.
But Dean is somebody that you know and love, right?
Somebody that is family to family, if I can say it that way. His cousins are my cousins.
I see.
Side of the family. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And so trying to figure out how to speak into that space. I also want to stay in connection to family, right? So it's not just a matter of although he will say you're an asshole. I choose not to try to say that type of stuff, although I think he feels like I do, because I ask questions that nobody else asks him. And so it feels like an attack on him, and I'm trying not to attack with him. So, but that's essentially what he tried to say. And so I said, look, the reason I ask whatever I ask is because I think you're intelligent enough that you can answer, and yet you continually go back to "you are an asshole" type of statements instead of being in the conversation, right? And that's hard because in many ways he doesn't want the conversation because I ask him questions that are harder for him to want to address. And so it's much simpler if he just can
attack you.
Yeah, make me into the insult that he throws at me. But so in that post-election time, when there is a real possibility of people rising up in rebellion, there's several things that could save us in that moment. And at least one of those is somebody who is connected to the one who would rise up in rebellion, being there enough that they can say, let's not do that. Right? And that person listening. And I don't think I'm going to be able to be that person in Dean's life, for example, but maybe in somebody else who maybe influences him. So who knows? It's hard for us, isn't it?
Yes.
It feels so much like the slide that we all studied about that led to the Civil War. The series of compromises, decade-long slide of further and further apart from each other until at some point or other it became inevitable that we had to do that. And I see so much of those same dynamics, and I say, I wish I knew how to stop that.
So I don't know, is there still violence going on in the demonstrations across our country?
Depends on who you talk to. For example, Dean thinks that of course there is, right? It's happening every night. They're being violent every night. But then he thinks, this is my take, he thinks that the people who are protesting, he doesn't see protesters at all. He sees just rioters.
Oh.
Does that make sense? And so he's lumping them too much into just the bad guys that they are, right? And that affects every single one of the people that are out there in that type of thing. And so he is able to what am I trying to say? He's able to excuse a whole lot of stuff. So
But the news hasn't been telling us anything about those things lately.
No.
It's all been into Trump's COVID.
Yeah. But discontent, to be fair, discontent helps his story of we need more law and order.
Dean, now you're talking about?
Dean, yes.
Yeah.
Right. But also this man who wrote about the Marquis, his narrative also is that
Yes.
BLM is only doing all of these things, which allows him to see it more and more as a negative group that needs to be fought against, that needs to be condemned. My thing comes down to that primarily, first of all, we should see them as a group that needs to be listened to. And if you're busy fighting the rioters more than listening to the protesters, you're going to continually have more and more rioters and less and less people that will try to talk to you because you haven't listened.
Right. Huh.
But it's really easy, like in this chapter, to try to fix Dean.
Except, you're powerless over Dean's thoughts.
I get that. And so my thrust usually is not that, but I think he sees it always as that. And my thrust has always been ultimately, how do we solve this system in this moment? When I wrote back to him, because he kind of put out a flippant thing because I asked him after I told my statement about things. I said, now, did you really want me to answer your questions that you put out in that other thing? And he said something along the lines of, yeah, I'm not going to listen, but go ahead and say it.
Oh.
One of those types of statements, right? So I wrote back to him and I just said, here's my take, that if you're going to do these things, you got to do them differently than what you're doing right now. Hey, Leticia, how are you? We do have somebody else with us.
Welcome, Leticia.
Hi, thank you.
So, trying to figure out how to step into a space where the other person is thinking and reacting very differently from you is really hard, right? Because they're going to see it differently than what you see it.
Yes.
Dean doesn't always want to listen to me, right?
No.
So my take with him was this, that you have to see a difference between rioters and protesters. You have to see that the right to protest is a good thing, and you can't just, that it's a constitutional right. It's in our First Amendment, right? The right to free speech, the right to assembly. That's all part of our the most precious sections of our Constitution. And you can't just write that off. And when you just decide, like the meme that he put out, that these are all just rioters and we can do whatever we want to and we should have law and order, well, you're not really bringing law and order. You're bringing something different than that.
More violence.
Right? So how do we help? Kind of going back to the chapter, how do we help solve the system, not just fix the individual?
Here's what I struggle in that conversation with is that we all have confirmation bias. And we end up talking sides rather than talking common ground.
Yes.
trying to define Jim, what's your tolerance line when it becomes a riot?
Yeah.
And so that we can come to an agreement, something, and that's the hardest part.
It is.
I posted something that I had posted before the 2016 election. One of the things I said is that we're living in a world where everybody's talking sound bites.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
And that's really difficult to get past because we all have our own perspective of what's tolerable, right?
Mm.
And so we get stuck. We get terribly stuck through the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah. As I talk to Dean, for example, when I try to bring things up, what I'm often trying to say is something more along the lines of, you're so busy seeing them as wrong that you don't listen to them. And he sees that always as a, you want to support. He said something along these lines. Let me see if I can see this. A drug-infested criminal, a low-life criminal, all of those kinds of words where he vilifies people and at the same time elevates cops. Now, I don't want to lower cops at all, but I think he sees my responses to him as always doing that, as denigrating that which he holds very high in esteem.
So he projects his bias out onto you.
Yeah, yeah. And I try really hard not to trigger that, but it's hard. I mean, especially today in our world, the battle lines are really harshly drawn, right? Like the guy who drove by the marquee and said, you have to condemn white supremacy. I know you have to condemn Black Lives Matter or you're racist. And, isn't open to a nuanced conversation, or not easily open to it.
No.
Did you read through that series that I was sharing on the radical centrist?
I read some of it. Radical centrism is a really tough thing because no matter where we're at, we've too easily told ourselves the opposite. I believe when it comes right down to it, Jesus was a radical centrist.
Yeah, and the gentleman that wrote that, I've been friends with for 45 years.
Yeah.
And he, the reason why I asked if you read them is that he describes the battle we have as radical centrists, because I sit there and I get to a point where I don't want to talk to anybody on either side.
Yeah.
Right. But the one thing with all the radical centrists that I know, and I know a lot of them, is that even though we don't want to have those conversations, we have to go back into them. We have to go back into them.
Yeah. Well, the things that we worry about most, things like Nazism, which is a radical rightist movement, or communism, which is a radical leftist movement. And I think we're correct in being fearful of those kinds of things. The hard part is that it's really easy for all of us to project all of the radical bad on the other side.
Yes.
But Jesus saying things like love your enemy wasn't taking the side of left, right, up, or down, right? It was saying whoever that you think has all the evil, love them anyway. And that's really hard for us, because if that's the person who's causing all the issues in the world, that's a good person for me not to love.
I have my prayer life, I have a side in a folder of all the people whose opinions I do not like. And I pray for them, since Jesus said, pray for your enemies. And I had the experience of Michael Gerson was on that list. And then I started reading his columns in the newspaper, and I started to like him.
Yeah.
I started to love him. And a friend from high school knew him from Wheaton College and knew how ill he was with depression and had a lot of compassion for him. And so that was a really positive experience of praying. I mean, it only happened out of the 50 probably that are on that side of my folder, but still that was progress from praying for my enemies.
Yeah. The good news is that there's always more people. There's always a lot of good about even the people that seem to be very against you. There's good stuff about them. You just have to get past the stuff that's not so good. You have to figure out how to
get down from the head to the heart.
Yeah, absolutely. And
one of the hardest things when you're having those conversations is to get people to stop speaking in absolutes.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the hardest things.
That's what those arguments are. There's only this is absolute.
Yeah. This is always a bad, this is always a good. But you know why we all do that? Plato long ago started dividing, and it was there before him, but he's the one who really codified it, started taking the world and making it into a dualistic world, good, evil, up, down. And the hard part about that is not that we do that, it's that's too simplistic. It's not just up and down, high and low. There's a lot of nuances between it. But worse than that even is when we take the duality and we put a higher value on one or the other.
That reminds me of something you said when you first came that I haven't forgotten. I think it was a children's time. We talk about black and white and marrying them with gray. No, we have the whole spectrum of all the colors in between black and white. And I thought, there's diversity. That's wonderful.
That's right. And that's what we've got to start talking about, is not the dualistic world, but the very nuanced world, right?
Yes.
In all the different ways, because how do you compare purple and red? Which is better? Sometimes it's what's the situation you're trying to use it in.
And then that's that wonderful movie for the kids.
That's a good example. You can't separate purple and red because you don't get purple without red.
That's right. That's right.
Right. And it wasn't just that. Look at the development of, regardless if you're Catholic or not, it all came off of Catholicism, right?
Right.
Dante with Inferno even muddled the good and bad even more.
Yeah. But you know why something like Dante is so compelling to us? Because we all know somebody that we want to send to those deepest levels. Right? And suddenly he gave us the punishment for them.
Mm.
And they have somebody too, and maybe it's me. Right? And somehow there has to be, I think what Jesus is trying to say in much of his work is bring us to a different space than that. And in racial relations, it's really easy to say anybody of a certain color. And that's why they say the 1 drop rule or the 2 drop rule or the 3 drop rule, because that makes somebody else lower than you.
Yes.
Right? And Jesus was much more of a, nope, they're part of you.
Yeah.
Right? And that's hard for us because maybe we are holding on to that other thing for really good reasons, because somebody like that person we're condemning, right, is hurt. I don't know if I told you about, or not is hurt, but hurt us. Have I told you about my cousin's wife? Her name is Christy. Not my cousin, excuse me, my nephew's wife. So this is my oldest nephew, Matthew, and his wife, Christy. will put some really horrible things about immigrants on there, has a huge prejudice against immigrants. But you know why? Because she has a very good friend of hers who was murdered by an immigrant.
Uh-huh.
So it's hard for her not to paint this other immigrant with the same brush of hate or revenge or hurt that she feels about the one who killed her friend. And so in talking with her, I have to be really careful not to diminish the hurt that she feels, rightfully feels, but also to try to help her to see, but this person is not that person.
We've been conditioned to do that, like
We
in
have.
relationships, right? I've had multiple relationships.
Yeah.
And there's always this point where partners will come back and say, well, but Susan would do this. And so it's helping people. That's where I am with the centrist thing. Helping people identify, why do you go there?
Yeah.
Why do you go there? And it happens on both spectrums. You know, why are we looking at people and doing the absolutes? There's times in some of these chats where somebody says, and they were Roman Catholic. You know, it goes beyond the race stuff. It's part of our whole lexicon at this point.
Right. There's all kinds of ways that there's all kinds of ways that we trigger each other. Last night in the debate, for example, Kamala Harris, in response to some religious talk, I've got right religion, she responded by saying, isn't it nice that Joe Biden, if elected, will be our second Roman Catholic president? And you know, and try to remind each other that those kinds of religious things that we sometimes draw lines about are not our best way to draw lines.
I have a friend that's been really liberal since high school. We went to South Point. And she's done a whole lot of liberal, far liberal activism within Tucson.
Uh-huh.
And when we came back, we had lunch, and she goes, you know, everybody we went to school with, or not everybody, not me, but a lot of them are very, very conservative. The majority of them are. And she goes, I don't know, you know, all my Catholic buddies are all conservative. I don't know why I'm tend towards socialism. And I said, well, if you look at Christianity, it is socialist.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it all depends on what you're reacting to. Having grown up in Mormonism, which also tends to be very conservative, sometimes where I'm at is in response to that. But it's also because of that. My mom was one who tried to teach me better than just the conservatism that she had experienced within Mormonism. And so she's the one who launched me into being not conservative. Showed me, you know, essentially showed me the not pretty side of that going too far.
I have the same issue with being raised by Democrats, right?
Uh-huh.
But my mom only gets one source of information, and she's a straight party person. And for, you know, in the end, I'm anti-authoritarian.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I read, I question, I talk. That's how I do this. And she and I can't talk politics. She doesn't understand, because anything right of center in her mind is a Republican. And we're all crazy, and we all don't care about people, and we're all just taking care of corporate interests, and that's not true.
Yeah, but see, that's that's why that dualism really works, because why we continue to embrace it is because it makes it really simple for me to say, I no longer have to listen to that, them, you, because you're obviously on the other side, and that's a lesser side than my side. And
yeah, and I got really keyed in on this when the night that Hillary Clinton conceded, right? My daughter lives outside in a very rural area outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. And she called me at 3:00 in the morning, her time, just panicking because there were white sheets walking with the guns and the torches and everything else.
yeah,
And she goes, Mom, I'm really afraid. And this daughter looks white. Her name's Erin Johnson. And he said, just don't go outside.
yeah,
And don't tell him you're Hispanic.
yeah.
Because she has the luxury of doing that.
That's right. But here's the real difficulty of that. The darker you are, the more you can't pass for white, the more you can't avoid things like that.
Yeah.
And it's real simple for me to say, well, it's not a problem, because from my places of advantage, it isn't a problem for me. So I can easily pass it off. But do I hear the voices of the people who can't? Right? My friend Dean wants to just look at the rioters. And believe me, the rioters should be thought about. But that means that he's able to not have to, because he doesn't have to worry about the protesters because it doesn't affect him that much. And yet listening to the protesters might be what will solve this. But he doesn't want to think that. It's easier just to say, let's just write them all off.
You know, like we've talked about, the biggest problem is there are nuances to the problems that we're not looking at.
Yeah.
And any resolution is always going to have some kind of compromise somewhere.
Yeah. But see, that gives him permission, essentially, just like in the section about color, lights get permission to not have to worry as much about darks, and vice versa. Darks get, because they write each other off. But isn't that what we do on a too regular basis as well? Is we easily write each other off because it's easier or more convenient for us. And
we had this discussion in white fragility, and I used the word objectification. Or not, yeah. We objectify people. We turn them into a thing instead of people. Yeah. We also do that when we're having these conversations. Oh, you're just that right-wing kind of guy.
Yeah.
So you stop talking to the human being.
Yep. Because that's simpler. It's much simpler to do that. You know, in the past little while, the last couple of days, I've been getting pictures of Matthew Shepard on, you know, because it's the anniversary of his death. You know, Matthew Shepard, who was killed and hung on a fence in Wyoming. I believe that more easily happens if you can just turn him into that gay, right? The pejorative that you no longer have to see quite as a real human being. And many of the things we do when we do the dynamics of that he's talking about in these sections is we turn people into something less than, because it's easier for us then.
It's either a thing or a group.
Yeah.
Or a skin color.
Whatever it happens to be, or a gender.
And
right?
See, what I realized with my daughter is she identifies as being Hispanic, and she thinks everybody can tell. That's how deep-seated, and she recently started talking to me about that, and it was because my kids didn't have to deal with it, but they were with me when I had to deal with it, right? So they were as observers, they said this isn't right. And And I think that's why they ended up identifying strongly with the Hispanic side, because of the injustice that they would see happen. And I had to explain to them at one point, and say, yeah, it's, for me, it's annoying. For others, it's not.
Yeah.
Lack of, I get really mad at education, because there are very subtle ways that the education system has denied people of color
Right.
to develop their intellect to the level that they can fight for themselves.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And often that's because it's simpler, Leticia, right? Like this, I mean, I told you about this, the statistics of how bilingual ed versus ESL works, right? The one consigns people to less than average, and the other to more than average. But here's the thing, you know why we do the one, why we do ESL? It's simpler for an English speaking teacher. It's simpler for a system. It's simpler, and so we perpetuate that.
And I have discussions with Hispanics that are having problems with school boards, right? Or teachers or whatever. You told the story of the little kid that did really well with money, right?
Huh?
I go in and, they fight about, are we gonna do Chicano history or this kind of stuff, but they don't fight for the things culturally that are strong in those cultures. And I think the Blacks have also been denied that
Yeah.
unique, and it goes back to if you were only just a little more white. But each culture has a strong suit as a culture that we're denying.
Right.
And it messes up our ability to educate the kids to the best level.
Yeah, and the hard part is it's this. If I talk more about Marcus Garvey, it means that I'm going to have to study something I don't know as much about. And so I just keep talking about Davy Crockett because I already know about that.
Mm-hmm.
And so doing that broader teaching means that I'm going to have to broaden myself as an individual. I'm going to have to venture into things that I don't know as much about, or don't have the easy stories right on the tip of my tongue, and that's challenging to us.
On the other side, I get lambasted a lot because I got a broad sense of knowledge, and those kind of people, I don't want to say those people, but those kind of people that don't want to broaden get upset with me and call me a know-it-all. And it's like, no, I'm curious. Like, I like debating, so I go out and I read, and I hear both sides, and I want to know, it's like telephone or two people coming to you, and they have a conflict, right?
Yeah.
And you listen to both sides, and the truth is kind of in the middle, right?
Uh-huh.
It's the same with what's going on here too. I didn't listen to the debate last night, but it's interesting for me. I'm reading what their perspectives are. So tonight I'll listen to the debate. And again, that confirmation bias, we want to feel safe.
Yeah.
And they don't understand that in this particular arena, if we don't step out of that confirmation bias, none of us are going to be safe eventually.
That's right. For me as a teacher, though, it's also this. Yes, talking about Davy Crockett may be easier for me, but does it make as big of an impact on this person over here? Does it help with the stories that he's hearing at home? Does it help with part of, is it drawing from that which gives him definition and strength? And that doesn't mean I don't talk about Davy Crockett. It means that I have to also say what else can be added in. So I told you about my songbook, didn't I?
Yeah.
Have I told you about my songbook before, Judith?
Phone book?
Song book.
Oh, song. Yes.
I started doing that because I knew that there had to be good songs in Spanish. If I'm going to be teaching Spanish kids, I wanted to be able, Spanish speaking kids, I wanted to be able to draw from some of what they were hearing at home to be able to move forward. I wanted, you know, them to sing a song that mom would recognize and maybe sing back to them and things like, but, and I found that there's absolutely incredible songs. The song Juanito is one of my very favorite with my English kids or my Spanish kids. And, but that means you have to go through the struggle of doing more. You can't be the only arbiter of what is truth, right? And too often in education, well, but too often in education, that's what we've done is we've decided I have all knowledge and I'm giving it to them. Where in reality, they have other people have a whole lot of stuff, and can I learn from them? And so if we go back to the field slave versus the house slave, both bring important components to the Black narrative and to what's happening there. But do we give credence to both sides? Our time's up. Sorry that this has been a great discussion.
I was just thinking my time is up. Okay.
Yeah. So we need to go, but thank you for that. We'll continue on with stuff. The good news is we're this week we talked about color and white and we've solved it all. Next week we're talking about black, right? Because the issues continue, and he'll continue to draw us on down some of these things.
Real quick before I sign off, Jim, yes. I sent you a text on Facebook.
Oh yes, I saw it, and I'm sorry that I haven't been able to answer. It's been
that's okay.
Memorial services as well as a commentary.
I just don't want to put them out there and say I'm going to use it for 50% of that until I passed it by you.
Yeah, the challenge is going to be trying to figure out how to make it so that it's available, so it doesn't feel mercenary to some people, and it always will feel mercenary in some ways. We just have to figure out ways to be able to make it so that it feels less like you're trying to make money off of, and that's truly how you're trying to support. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's why I went to you, because I'm living on grant money.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's still, and it's not 50% of the profit. It's 50% of the sales.
Yeah.
Total sales, and I'm absorbing the costs on that. One of the ideas, I think, on one of our talks, you asked if people were writing more notes and cards and stuff. So,
and I think probably people are. I think especially a population that's older, that is more schooled in that type of thing, to where they were writing things. What we probably need to do is just talk to Melissa to say, how would you like to advertise this somehow?
Or even just because I'm just going to put it up like on Marketplace.
Yeah.
And it can just be shared.
Yeah.
And I'll post, if I put it up on Marketplace, it's going to be on my